The champagne was expensive. The lawyer was precise. And Marcus Whitfield's smile was the kind that belonged to men who believed they had conquered empires. He sat at the glossy conference table with pen in his hand. The city spread behind him in a wall of glass. The late afternoon light bounced off the neighboring towers and caught the edge of his gold watch as he leaned in. "It is done," he said, signing the final document with a flourish that felt like a coronation. Across the table, his wife of 18 years sat motionless. Elena did not cry. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice, or her eyes, or her hand. She simply nodded once, gathered her single folder, and left the conference room in silence. No slammed doors, no last-minute pleas, no dramatic scenes, just the soft click of the latch as it shut behind her. Marcus watched her go and felt nothing but satisfaction. He had kept the estate, the company shares, the vacation homes, even her late father's art collection, now legally his through a clause she had never noticed until it was too late. His lawyer, a man who earned more in a month than some did in a year, cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I should mention she did not contest a single term." Marcus laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off glass and polished wood. "Of course she did not," he said. "Elena never had the spine for war." The lawyer smiled politely, but his eyes flicked briefly to the closed door. What Marcus did not know, what he could not have known, was that Elena had not come to fight. She had come to watch him sign his own ending. Somewhere across the city, in an unmarked office overlooking the financial district, a woman with silver-streaked hair opened a file labeled simply, "Whitfield M." She did not smile. She did not frown. She merely adjusted her glasses, took a sip of jasmine tea, and began to read. The game had already begun. Marcus Whitfield was a man who measured success in square footage and silence. He believed that the more space he owned and the fewer people who could question him inside it, the more he had won. At 46, he owned 3 properties across 2 continents, held executive positions in companies he barely visited, and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. To those who met him at parties and boardrooms, Marcus spoke about his life as if it were a straight line of victories. He had built his empire through calculated risks, relentless work, and ruthless efficiency. Or so he told himself, and anyone who would listen. The truth began in a very different place. Marcus had grown up in a narrow 2-bedroom house on the edge of a fading industrial town. His father, Daniel, worked long shifts at a factory that made parts no one ever saw as finished products. His mother, Ruth, worked part-time at a grocery store and full-time at holding what was left of the family together. He remembered the sound of his father's boots on the front step, the way his mother's back straightened when the door opened, and the smell of machine oil and sweat that clung to his father's clothes. Daniel did not talk much about work, but he talked about respect. "You always look a person in the eye," Daniel would say. "You do not talk down to anyone who works for a living. You do not step on people to climb. You will never be so important that you can forget that." When Marcus was a boy, he believed him. He admired his father's rough hands and the way neighbors nodded at him on the street. But admiration did not ease the sting when the other kids laughed at Marcus's scuffed shoes or his secondhand backpack. In high school, he finally escaped their small world by winning a scholarship to a prestigious university in the city. His parents cried when the letter came. His mother hugged him so tightly he could hardly breathe. His father shook his hand, then pulled him into a rare embrace. "Remember where you came from," his father whispered in his ear. "And remember who helped you get there." At university, Marcus discovered a different universe. Students arrived in sleek cars, wearing clothes that looked effortless and cost a month of his father's wages. They spoke casually about vacations abroad and family investments. They treated the future as something guaranteed. Marcus felt small. He hated feeling small. There was a moment early on that he never forgot. He attended a networking event, standing by a table of cheeses he could not identify, clutching a paper cup of wine. A group of students were laughing nearby, telling stories about their parents and their connections. One of them, a tall young man in an expensive blazer, turned to Marcus and asked, "So, what does your family do?" "My father works in manufacturing," Marcus said. "My mother is in retail." The tall student nodded politely, then turned back to his friends. The conversation flowed around Marcus like water around a stone. No one asked another question. That night, Marcus lay awake and replayed the moment. The polite nod. The way the conversation had moved on without him. It was not cruelty. It was worse. It was indifference. He promised himself he would never be insignificant again. He studied hard, not out of love for the subject, but out of hunger. He took internships at firms where no one knew his parents' names. He watched the children of wealth glide through doors that stuck for him, and he memorized every gesture, every phrase, every signal that said, "I belong here." In his final year, he met Elena Moretti. She was not like the others. She dressed simply but elegantly. She listened more than she spoke. In class discussions, when she did speak, the room grew quiet. Professors nodded. Students leaned in. Marcus first noticed her at a seminar on economic ethics. He watched as she gently dismantled a classmate's argument about profit at any cost, not with aggression, but with a series of quiet questions that revealed a bigger picture. After class, they walked out together. She asked him what he thought about the material. He said what he always said, that efficiency and growth mattered, that the winners were the ones who took risks and did not apologize for wanting more. She had smiled then, not mockingly, just thoughtfully. "There is nothing wrong with wanting more," she said. "The question is what you are willing to lose to get it, and whether you notice who is holding the ladder for you while you climb." He did not understand what she meant at the time, but he liked the way she spoke. Measured, calm, certain. They began to spend more time together. She told him about her family in fragments, a grandfather who had started with nothing and built a business through patient work and good relationships. A father who had turned that business into something quieter and more influential, and a mother who had poured much of their wealth into education, healthcare, and art. They did not flaunt their money, they did not hang their names on buildings, but their fingerprints were on institutions across the city. Marcus met them formally a year after he and Elena started dating. He wore his best suit. He rehearsed polite answers. He thought he was ready. They welcomed him into a house filled with books, paintings, and quiet laughter. He watched as Elena's father spoke to the staff by name, asked about their families, listened to their answers. He watched as guests from different backgrounds mingled easily, united not by status, but by a sense of purpose. At dinner, her father asked Marcus about his future. "I want to build something big," Marcus said. "I want to prove that where you start does not determine where you end." Her father listened, then nodded. "Ambition can be good," he said. "Just remember that the higher you climb, the more people will be under your feet. Make sure you can look down and still respect yourself." At the time, Marcus took it as encouragement. He heard, "Go higher." He did not hear, "Be careful how." When they married, it was a beautiful, understated ceremony. Marcus felt like he was stepping in a world that had always been closed to him. Guests greeted him warmly. People he had only read about shook his hand. In the photographs, he looked dazzled. He did not notice in those early years how many doors opened because Elena's family unlocked them. A board seat appeared at a firm that had never heard of him. A mentor recommended him for a position at a company he had no real connection to. Investment opportunities crossed his desk with terms he could never have secured alone. He worked hard. He made good impressions. He believed with growing conviction that he had earned every step. Elena knew better. She had always known. For 18 years, she watched him take credit for paths she had quietly cleared. She watched him dismiss people who did not speak the language of deals and margins. She watched him humiliate staff, brush off advisors, and treat kindness like currency to be spent only when profitable. She offered him other perspectives, gently at first. "Not every good decision shows up on a balance sheet," she would say. He would smile and kiss her forehead and change the subject. As time went on, his smile grew thinner, his patience shorter. His jokes about her simple interests grew sharper at dinner parties where he performed for people whose respect he craved. He made remarks about her books, museums, and quiet nonprofit work, calling them hobbies in a tone that turned the word into a dismissal. Sometimes guests laughed, sometimes they looked away. Elena swallowed the hurt and kept the evening from collapsing. The divorce did not explode out of nowhere. It arrived like a tide that had been rising slowly for years. Marcus had affairs, discreet at first, then careless. He entertained the attention of younger women who admired his confidence and his apparent power. Elena found messages, then saw behavior she could no longer excuse as stress or distraction. When she finally asked for separation, she did so without raised voice or theatrics. She spoke plainly. "I cannot do this anymore," she said. "I cannot stand next to you while you become someone I do not recognize." Marcus heard something else. He heard an obstacle. He heard a problem to be solved, a threat to his narrative. He hired the most aggressive attorney in the city. He buried her in paperwork. He used every legal mechanism to delay, to pressure, to exhaust. He turned their marriage into a battlefield and called it necessity. And when the settlement came, he made sure it crushed her. The estate in Connecticut, the Manhattan penthouse, the shares in Whitfield and Sterling, the Moretti art collection, 12 pieces worth $8 million, technically marital property because they had hung in their homes. On paper, it was all fair. On paper, he had simply played the game better. Elena walked away with a fraction. A coastal property neither of them used. Some jewelry. A trust fund that was comfortable but unremarkable. Enough to live, not enough to compete. Marcus celebrated that night with colleagues who congratulated him on his clean escape. "She should have hired better representation," someone joked. Marcus raised his glass. "She should have married better," he said. The laughter felt like vindication. It echoed in his ears as he went home to his glass-walled life, believing he had won. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Marcus noticed the first irregularity. A client he had worked with for 6 years, a pharmaceutical company preparing for a major merger, quietly switched consulting firms. There was no explanation, just a polite email thanking him for past services and wishing him well. Marcus frowned but dismissed it. Business was cyclical. Clients came and went. He told himself he was too seasoned to panic. 2 weeks later, another client left. Then another. His assistant, a diligent woman who had learned to read his moods, mentioned that several board meeting invitations had not arrived. Events he had attended for years suddenly had capacity issues or restructured guest lists. Marcus called an old friend, a venture capitalist he had known since business school. They had once celebrated each other's deals with expensive dinners and careless jokes. "Richard, what is happening?" Marcus asked. "I am getting frozen out of deals I should be hearing about." There was a pause. When Richard spoke, his voice was careful. "Marcus, I do not know how to say this delicately," he said. "Your name is circulating. Not in a good way." "What does that mean?" Marcus demanded. "It means people are being advised to create distance," Richard said. "I do not know who started it. I do not know why. But it is effective. I am sorry." The call ended. Marcus sat in his office, overlooking the city he had thought he owned, and felt the first whisper of unease. Someone was moving against him. But who? And why now? He thought of Elena, then dismissed the idea immediately. She was a grieving woman living in a modest house by the sea. She had no influence, no connections that were not tied to her family, and her family had always been civil, if distant. No, this had to be something else. A business rival, a disgruntled employee, someone he had outmaneuvered years ago and forgotten. Marcus was good at enemies. He knew how to fight back. What he did not know was that he had already lost. In a quiet office that smelled of jasmine tea and old books, the woman with silver-streaked hair reviewed her notes. Her name was Sofia Castellano. She was 73 years old, small, and unremarkable to anyone who did not know where to look. She wore simple clothes and comfortable shoes. She spoke softly, but people who understood how power moved through a city whispered another name for her. They called her the architect, a woman who built collapses the way others built empires. Sophia did not take every case. She did not need to. Her clients were selective, and her methods were legendary in circles where reputation mattered more than headlines. She never shouted, never threatened, never left fingerprints. She simply rearranged the world until gravity did the rest. 6 months before the divorce was finalized, Elena Moretti had come to see her. She had arrived early, sitting in the small reception area with her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple dress and no visible jewelry. To a stranger, she might have looked like any other middle-aged woman waiting for a routine appointment. When Sophia invited her in, Elena stepped into an office lined with books rather than trophies. There were no cityscape photographs, no symbols of conquest. Just shelves, a desk, a pot of tea, and two chairs. Sophia listened as Elena spoke. She did not interrupt. She did not rush. She took notes in a neat, compact handwriting that revealed nothing to someone who glanced at the page. "I do not want him ruined," Elena said eventually. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were tired. "I do not want his name dragged through the mud. I do not want to hurt him in ways I cannot take back." "Then what do you want?" Sophia asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I want him to understand," she said finally. "I want him to see what he built his life on. I want him to see who he became. And I want him to watch the things he worshiped disappear, not because I stole them, but because he never truly owned them." Sophia studied her. "That is not revenge," she said. "That is a lesson. Lessons are more difficult than vengeance. They take longer. They require restraint." "I have lived with restraint for 18 years, Elena said. "I can live with it a little longer." Sophia had listened, asked questions, tested Elena's motives like a structure for cracks. When she was satisfied that Elena did not want blood, she had taken the case. The first phase was simple: isolation. Sophia knew that men like Marcus derived power from networks, from access, from the belief that they were indispensable. She also knew that most of those networks were built less on merit than on perception, convenience, and quiet introductions no one talked about. She had spent decades cultivating relationships across industries: finance, law, media, philanthropy, not through aggression, but through quiet competence and strategic favors. She rarely asked for anything. When she did, people listened. One conversation with the right person, one polite suggestion, one well-timed piece of information framed as concern rather than accusation. Perhaps it is wise to review all current external consultants. Have you considered the reputational risk of certain associations? "I have heard some stories about the way he handled his personal affairs. It may not reflect the values your organization wants to project." Doors closed. Invitations stopped. Contracts were not renewed. And Marcus Whitfield began to disappear from rooms where decisions were made. He did not see the strings. He only felt the floor shifting beneath him. 4 months after the divorce, Marcus's company received notice that their largest contract, a 5-year consulting agreement with a European conglomerate, was under review. "Technical compliance issues," the email stated. "We are exploring alternative partnerships while we resolve these concerns." Marcus called his contact there, a senior director he had golfed with in Scotland. They had laughed together on green hills and clinked glasses in wood-paneled clubhouses. "Thomas, what is going on?" Marcus asked. "We have exceeded every benchmark." Thomas sounded uncomfortable. "Marcus, this is above my level," he said. "Legal and executive leadership are making the call." "I am sorry." The contract was worth $14 million annually. 2 weeks later, it was terminated. His CFO, a man who had enjoyed the ride up and now feared the slide down, looked grim during their emergency meeting. "We can absorb this for a while," he said, "but we will need to restructure, cut staff, reduce overhead. The burn rate is too high." "Find out who is behind this," Marcus demanded. "Someone is sabotaging us." But every inquiry led nowhere. The conglomerate cited strategic realignment, market shifts, internal priorities. No scandal, no accusation, just a business decision that somehow aligned with a dozen others. Marcus started sleeping poorly. He would wake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, mentally reviewing deals, searching for enemies, building theories that never quite held together. His second marriage, to a marketing executive 15 years his junior, began to fracture under the strain. Vanessa had married the image of him. She had married the lifestyle, the invitations, the sense of elevation that came with being his wife. She had not married him for nights spent listening to him pace the floor, muttering about conspiracies and betrayals. "You are obsessed," she said one night, arms folded as she stood in the doorway of their bedroom. "You are seeing conspiracies everywhere." "Because someone is coming after me," he said. "You would understand if you had ever built anything." She flinched at the jab. "Or maybe," she said quietly, You are just not as important as you thought. She moved into the guest room that week. 2 months later, she moved out, leaving behind a note on the kitchen counter. I cannot watch this anymore, as it said. You are becoming someone I do not recognize. Or maybe you always were, and I just did not notice. She did not ask for much money in the separation. She only wanted distance. Meanwhile, Sophia's second phase unfolded with the patience of someone accustomed to long games. She targeted the foundation of Marcus's wealth, not with illegal maneuvers, but with pressure applied at key joints. She knew his properties carried significant mortgages, refinanced multiple times to fund other investments. She knew his company's debt structures were legal but fragile, dependent on consistent cash flow and favorable interest rates. She made a call to a friend at a private equity firm. The Whitfield portfolio, she said. What is your assessment? Overextended, came the reply. Strong on paper but vulnerable to pressure? Why? Just curious, Sophia said. 3 weeks later, interest rates on Marcus's commercial loans increased. Not dramatically, not illegally, just enough to tighten margins. A major investor in his consulting firm requested an audit, a routine procedure technically, but expensive and time-consuming. The audit slowed new deals. Rumors of it made other investors cautious. Property taxes on his Connecticut estate were reassessed, jumping 40%. Insurance premiums on his assets increased due to newly defined regional risk factors. Each event, in isolation, was mundane. Each was defensible. Together, they were suffocating. His accountant called an emergency meeting. You need to liquidate some assets, the accountant said. The cash flow is not sustainable. If we do not act, you will start missing payments within the year. Which assets? Marcus asked, though he already knew. Probably the Connecticut house, the accountant said. Maybe the art collection. The art collection. Elena's father's paintings. The pieces he had taken because he could, because they were legally his, because he had wanted to win completely. Marcus stared at the spreadsheet and felt something unfamiliar. Powerlessness. While his finances crumbled, his social standing evaporated. Invitations to charity galas stopped arriving. His name was removed from museum donor boards, quietly, with polite letters citing organizational restructuring and changing priorities. At a restaurant he frequented, the maître d', who used to greet him warmly, now offered only professional courtesy. His usual table was suddenly unavailable. One evening he arrived at a gala without a printed invitation, assuming his name would still be on the list. At the door, a young staff member checked the tablet, frowned, and shook her head. I am sorry, sir, she said. You are not on tonight's guest list. Check again, he said. She checked again. The answer did not change. He stepped back, feeling eyes on him. People who used to wave him over now looked away. It was not contempt. It was worse. It was indifference edging into avoidance. Vanessa left him on a Tuesday morning, taking her jewelry and leaving behind that brief note. His lawyer, the same aggressive attorney who had demolished Elena in court, began to answer his calls with a kind of weary restraint. I want to know who is doing this, Marcus said during one such call. I want investigations. I want... Marcus, the lawyer interrupted, I have been looking informally. There is nothing actionable. No fraud, no defamation, no conspiracy. Just a series of decisions by institutions and individuals who are choosing lower risk options. That is not possible, Marcus said. It is business, the lawyer said. It is life. Sometimes the market turns against you. Sometimes people decide you are not worth the trouble. But Marcus knew better, or told himself he did. This was not the market. This was personal. It had timing. It had pattern. He thought of Elena again, remembered her silence in the conference room, her lack of resistance, her single folder. What had been in that folder? 6 months after the divorce, Marcus sat alone in his penthouse, the one asset he refused to sell, and opened his laptop. He typed Elena's name into the search bar. What appeared on the screen shocked him. Elena Moretti had joined the board of 3 major nonprofits. She had been photographed at cultural events in London, Paris, and Tokyo. She had given a talk on strategic philanthropy that had millions of views online. In images, she stood at podiums, in galleries, and community centers. She spoke with activists, artists, educators, and business leaders. She looked not fragile, not broken, but radiant, confident. free. In every photo, in every article, there were names Marcus recognized. Power brokers, industry leaders, people who had stopped returning his calls. He scrolled further and found a year-old article in a financial magazine titled, "The Quiet Architects, Women Who Shape Industries from Behind the Scenes." The article profiled 5 women. Elena was not one of them, but Sofia Castellano was. Marcus clicked on her name. He read her biography. He saw phrases like strategic consultant and relationship architect. He read about her decades of work advising foundations, families, and institutions on how to build influence responsibly. He saw the client testimonials, vague but glowing. "She helped me understand my value," one of them read, signed by initials only, E.M. Philanthropist, E.M. Elena Moretti. Marcus closed his laptop slowly. He was not fighting bad luck or market forces. He was fighting a war he had never seen coming, waged by an enemy he had never noticed, on behalf of a woman he had underestimated completely. And he was losing. The Connecticut estate sold for less than Marcus hoped. The market was soft, and buyers sensed desperation. What was once a symbol of his elevation became a line item in someone else's portfolio. The art collection went to auction. Marcus attended, sitting in the back row in a suit that suddenly felt a size too large. He watched his 12 paintings, each one chosen by Elena's father, each one hung with care in homes Marcus had claimed as his victories, sold to strangers. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell in practiced cadence. Numbers climbed, paddles lifted. The room buzzed with the excitement of acquisition. One piece, a small abstract work Elena had particularly loved, sold to an anonymous bidder for 3 times its estimate. Marcus watched it carried away, its bright colors briefly framed against the gray wall, as if waving a final goodbye. He would learn later that the bidder was Elena herself. She hung it in her study, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Not of victory, but of value, the quiet difference between price and worth. His company struggled. Without contracts, without network access, without the invisible infrastructure that had always supported his deals, clients disappeared. He laid off staff. He cut salaries. He moved to a smaller office in a building without a view. His name, once associated with success and influence, now carried different connotations: arrogance, instability, risk. People stopped taking his calls. 10 months after the divorce, Marcus received an email from an unfamiliar address. "Mr. Whitfield, I believe it is time we spoke. Please meet me at the address below. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone." There was no signature, only an address and a suite number in a quiet part of the city. Marcus should have ignored it. He should have suspected a trap. But he was drowning, and even the illusion of answers felt like oxygen. The next day, he arrived at the building at 1:55 p.m. The lobby was plain, the elevator slow. On the directory, the suite number was listed with no company name. He knocked once on the door and heard a calm voice from inside. "Come in." The office was modest. Bookshelves lined the walls. A desk held a single laptop and a pot of steaming jasmine tea. There were 2 chairs facing each other with no barrier between them. Behind the desk sat Sofia Castellano. She was smaller than he had imagined, older, calmer. Lines marked her face, but her eyes were clear. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "thank you for coming." Marcus stayed standing. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who helps people understand consequences," she replied. "You have been destroying me," he said. Sophia poured tea into 2 cups, her movements unhurried. "I have not destroyed anything," she said. "I have simply removed the scaffolding you mistook for foundation." "On Elena's behalf," Marcus said. "On Elena's request," Sophia corrected gently. "There is a difference. She asked me to show you something, not to punish you, though I imagine it feels that way, to reveal what was always true." Marcus felt rage rising like heat in his throat. "What was always true?" he demanded. "That everything you thought you built," Sophia said, "your network, your access, your reputation, was borrowed. It was built on Elena's family, Elena's connections, Elena's quiet work behind every door you walked through. That is not—" "You believed your own story," she said. "That is not a crime. Many do. But when you discarded her, You discarded the foundation. What is happening now is not revenge. It is gravity. She opened a folder and slid it across the small table between them. Inside were documents, emails, meeting notes. Every major deal you have closed in the past 15 years, Sophia said. Look at the dates. Look at who made the introductions. Look at who was in the room before you entered. Marcus scanned the pages. He saw names he recognized and one he had tried not to think about. Elena. There she was, over and over. Quiet recommendations sent to board members. Strategic introductions made over private dinners. Conversations that happened weeks before his meetings. Smoothing paths he had thought he cleared himself. She never took credit, Sophia said. She never asked for recognition. She believed you were partners, that you would grow together. I earned, Marcus began. You performed well once the doors were open, Sophia said. That is not nothing. But the doors did not open because of you. They opened because of her family's trust in you, because of her words. The words hit him like physical blows. So this is revenge, Marcus said bitterly. You have destroyed my career, my marriage, my assets. I have done nothing but make phone calls, Sophia said. Shared truths. Ask people to reconsider relationships. Everything that has happened has been legal, ethical, and justified. No one owes you their trust or their association. Marcus sank into the chair opposite her. His anger flickered, then faltered. What does she want? He asked. What does Elena want from me? Sophia studied him for a long moment. She does not want you destroyed, she said. She wants you humbled. She wants you to understand what you took for granted. And more than that, she wants you to see that power is not what you thought it was. What is it then? He asked. Power is what remains when the performance ends, Sophia said. It is character, relationships, trust. You built a performance, Marcus. And performances do not survive without a stage, an audience, and people working behind the curtains. She slid another document toward him. This is a list of people who have asked about you, she said. Quietly, carefully. People who wonder if you have learned anything. Marcus picked it up. He recognized some names. They were not the titans he once courted, but they were not nobodies either. Smaller firms, nonprofits, regional organizations, modest consulting roles. Why would you give me this? He asked. Because Elena asked me to, Sophia said. She does not want you exiled. She wants you awake. She believes growth is possible, even for you, even from ruins. He laughed once without humor. Why should she care? She loved you, Sophia said simply. That does not vanish overnight. But she will not stand under a building that is collapsing anymore just to keep you looking tall. She stood and walked toward the door. You can rebuild, Marcus, she said. You can do honest work, make real connections, live a smaller but genuine life. Or you can cling to the ghost of who you thought you were and spend the rest of your days blaming the world for not applauding. She opened the door. The choice is yours, she said, but understand the world you knew is gone, not because I took it, because it was never really yours. She left him sitting in that modest office, holding a list of second chances and surrounded by evidence of his own mythology. In the months that followed, Marcus's life contracted. He sold his luxury car. He moved out of the penthouse he had once considered untouchable and into a smaller apartment with a view not of the skyline, but of a quiet street. He took consulting jobs that paid a fraction of what he had once commanded. He met with clients in modest conference rooms and coffee shops instead of elite clubs. He worked, he paid bills, he lived. It was ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of life he had once pitied from a distance. At first he tried to resist the change, pushing back against a reality he wasn't ready to accept. He caught himself telling old stories, inflating his role, clinging to the image of the man he had been. But he noticed slowly that when he did this now, no one seemed impressed. They listened politely, then steered the conversation back to the work at hand, to what matters. One day, he stood in line at a supermarket behind a tired nurse, buying groceries at the end of a long shift. No one looked twice at him. No one rushed to open a side register because of his presence. He was just another person waiting for his turn. He felt the old reflexive anger rising in him, the sense that he should not have to wait. Then, unbidden, he heard his father's voice in his mind. You will never be so important that you can forget that. The anger settled. He waited. When his turn came, he paid, bagged his own items, and walked out under a sky that did not care who he was. The clients he worked with now were different. They were smaller companies, nonprofits, community organizations, people who valued honesty over polish, projects that mattered more than the fee. They did not care how many galas he had attended. They cared whether he could solve their problems. A nonprofit asked him to help restructure their operations. The executive director was young, earnest, and overwhelmed. She reminded him in some ways of how Elena had been when they were young, full of purpose and still willing to believe that systems could be changed for the better. We cannot pay much, she admitted during their first meeting. We can offer a small retainer and some performance bonuses if things improve. That is fine, Marcus said, surprised to find he meant it. He found himself staying late in their cramped office, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see the plans through. He walked through their programs, talked to staff, listened to complaints and hopes. He created strategies that did not involve crushing anyone. He did good work, real work. The kind that did not come with applause or press releases, but left him feeling something he had almost forgotten, useful. He began to read again, not just financial reports and business biographies written to glorify their subjects, but books Elena used to recommend that he had dismissed as impractical. Philosophy, history, stories about people who had lost everything and found something else in the ruins. He joined a small community group that met once a week in a borrowed room above a library. They discussed life, choices, ethics. No one there knew about his former life in detail. When he chose to mention it, he did so with less flair and more honesty. He visited his sister more often, a woman he had ignored for years because she lived what he used to call a small life as a school teacher. One evening, they sat at her kitchen table, eating simple food and laughing about childhood memories. She watched him for a moment, then tilted her head. You seem different, she said. I am different, he replied. Better? She asked. He thought about it. He thought about all he had lost. The houses, the cars, the invitations, the way people used to lean in when he spoke. Not because of what he said, but because of who he was. Smaller, he said at last, but maybe more real. She smiled, lines crinkling at the corners of her eyes. Dad would have liked this version of you, she said. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest apartment, and thought about his father. A factory worker who had never made much money but had been respected by everyone who knew him. He had spent his life trying to be bigger than his father, richer, more important. He had succeeded for a while, but he had never been more respected. 2 years after the divorce, Marcus attended a charity event as a consultant for one of the host organizations. He wore a plain suit. His name was not on any marquee. He was there to make sure logistics ran smoothly and to advise on donor engagement strategy. He stood near a doorway, watching the flow of guests, when he saw her. Elena. She was across the room in conversation with a curator. She wore a simple, elegant dress and no obvious display of wealth. She laughed at something the curator said, then turned and their eyes met. For a moment, everything around them blurred. She did not look angry. She did not look victorious. She looked peaceful. Marcus felt the urge to cross the room, to explain, to apologize, to ask if she had known every detail of what had happened to him, to ask if she had forgiven him, to ask if she ever thought of the life they had once almost shared as partners instead of opponents. He took a step forward, then stopped, because in that moment he understood something Sophia had tried to tell him. Elena had not destroyed him. She had simply stopped protecting him from himself. The world had not changed. He had just finally seen it clearly. Elena spoke with the curator for a moment more, then excused herself and walked past him. As she did, she gave him a small nod, not of intimacy, not of triumph, just acknowledgement. He nodded back. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. 3 years after the divorce, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter. He did not send it immediately. He revised it over and over, trying to find words that were honest without being performative, apologetic without begging for forgiveness he did not deserve. At last, he folded it, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it. Elena, I do not expect a response. I do not expect forgiveness. I am writing because I finally understand something I could not see before. You were not an obstacle I defeated. You were a partner I betrayed. You were not weak for staying silent. You were strong for building without needing credit. I took everything I could in the divorce because I thought it proved I had won. I did not realize that I was taking pieces of a foundation I had never built. You have done well. I see your work everywhere now. Not because you promote it, but because it matters. That was always the difference between us. I wanted to be seen. You wanted to do something worth seeing. I am not the man you married. I am not even the man I thought I was. But I am trying to be someone better, someone smaller but more honest. Thank you for the lessons. They were expensive, but I finally learned them. Marcus. He never received a response. A month later, he received a small package with no return address. Inside was a book, a collection of essays on ethics and humility. On the first page, in elegant handwriting, there was a single line. Growth is possible, even from ruins. E. 5 years after the divorce, on a gray morning that turned slowly to gold, Marcus sat in a coffee shop reviewing proposals for a small consulting firm he had started. Nothing about it was glamorous. There were no global offices, no high-profile clients flashing their logos on his website, just organizations that needed guidance, people who wanted to build something steady and true. His apartment was comfortable but modest. His car was practical. His relationships were few but genuine. He had neighbors who knew his name, not because it was printed in magazines, but because he held the door for them and asked about their days. He was not wealthy anymore. He was not powerful, not in the way he had once understood power, but he was present. Across the city, Elena attended a museum opening. A new wing dedicated to emerging artists had been funded by a foundation she had built quietly over years. There were speeches and cameras, but her name was not emblazoned on the walls in large letters. It appeared only once, in a discreet acknowledgement among many. She stood in front of a familiar abstract painting, the one she had bought at auction, the one her father had loved, the one Marcus had claimed and lost. Someone approached her, a young artist whose work was hanging in the new wing. "That painting," the artist said, "it is beautiful. What does it mean to you?" Elena studied it for a moment, the brushstrokes, the colors, the spaces between them. "It reminds me," she said quietly, "that beauty survives, even when it is taken for granted." She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had always known the difference between winning and being whole. Some people measure success by what they accumulate. Others measure it by what they build. And a few, usually after losing far more than they intended, come to understand that the truest measure is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Marcus learned that lesson the hard way, through loss, through humiliation, through the slow, painful process of realizing that pride and power are not the same as worth. He rebuilt, not to reclaim his old glory, but to create something real, something small but honest. In that rebuilding, in the quiet work, in the ordinary days, he found something he had never possessed during his years of wealth and influence. He found a kind of peace, not constant happiness, not vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the person he saw in the mirror was finally someone he could respect, even if no one else was watching. That was the punishment Elena had designed, with Sophia's patient help. Not death, not poverty, not public disgrace. The punishment was life. Life without the illusions, life without the scaffolding, life with the weight of his choices resting where it had always belonged, on his own shoulders. The slow, irreversible process of becoming accountable to reality. In the end, that was far more devastating than any revenge could have been, and far more redemptive. Sometimes the greatest fall is not losing everything. It is finally seeing what we had and who we hurt when it is too late to undo the damage. But it is never too late to learn. It is never too late to become smaller in the eyes of the world and larger in the only place that matters, the quiet space of one's own conscience. What would you have done in Marcus's position? At what point would you have changed your path, if at all? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you reflect on your own life, consider liking, subscribing, and joining this channel for more stories like this.